All it took was 10 minutes for the idea of peace in Europe to be hanging by a thread. What should have been a diplomatic meeting instead sent shockwaves around the globe, making it seem inevitable that the US will withdraw aid from Ukraine. But what happens next? Will the United States step away from its allies? And if it does, what will that mean for Ukraine, Europe, and the future of global stability? The most immediate crisis Europe now faces is the geopolitical fallout from America's withdrawal from Ukraine. In early February 2025, Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei warned the world that the US and the West cannot be trusted to keep their promises, pointing directly to Ukraine's abandonment as proof. This is already undermining a careful network of partnerships and cooperation agreements between the US, NATO, and global alliances. It raises serious doubts among nations that once relied on American security guarantees. Now, many are asking themselves, can they really count on the US anymore? This uncertainty opens the door for China and Russia to expand their influence, drawing more nations into their orbit. Instead of creating stability, America's withdrawal may actually increase the chances of a global conflict. But for Europe, the real danger isn't just shifting alliances. It's what the White House just did to nuclear non-proliferation. Or to put it more bluntly, the United States just gave the entire world a reason to build more nuclear weapons. It's well known by now that after the fall of the Soviet Union, a large number of nuclear weapons fell into Ukrainian hands. If they had kept those weapons, they would have been one of the world's major nuclear powers. But under intense American and Western pressure, they agreed to give up those weapons in exchange for guarantees that their sovereignty wouldn't be violated. Since then, it has become abundantly clear this was a mistake. Europe's nuclear headache, courtesy of the White House, is that states which have either nuclear weapons or ambitions for nuclear weapons, nations like North Korea and Iran, now have zero incentives to give up their nuclear weapons programs. America can no longer be trusted to keep its commitments. And these nations have seen how readily the new America allows even democratic nations to be swallowed up by their aggressive neighbors. Likewise, nations with no nuclear weapons programs are now seriously considering the need to acquire weapons of their own. Nations such as Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Japan have expressed interest in nuclear weapons to one degree or another, but until recently had American security guarantees to fall back on. It was the Great Exchange to limit nuclear proliferation and reduce the risk of nuclear war. The US positioned itself as the ultimate security guarantor, offering ironclad assurances to its allies. Yet, just 45 days into the new administration, the US abandoned its commitments, proving just how quickly those guarantees can disappear. This creates a big problem for countries like Saudi Arabia and Japan, who face regional powers that either have nuclear weapons or actively want to acquire them. At the moment, Japan is a firm ally of the US, but there's no guarantee that the new administration will not change its mind on this nearly century-long alliance when it's no longer convenient for the White House. Even worse, the White House's willingness to court and even side with aggressive dictators who invade their neighbors sends a chilling message to US allies. For Japan, the implications are especially dire. With China's growing imperial ambitions and its push to dominate the Pacific, Japan now faces the terrifying prospect of standing alone against a rising superpower. For Europe, the risk of nuclear proliferation has just magnified overnight. But closer to home, a more immediate question looms. Can they really hold off Russian forces in Ukraine without US support? Trump claims that the US has given $350 billion in aid to Ukraine, but the numbers don't add up. The State Department itself says that the US has given $182.8 billion. However, independent sources such as the Kiel Institute place the figure of actual military hardware and military financial assistance closer to $119.7 billion. The $182 billion figure is inflated by the budget appropriated for training missions for US personnel in Europe, and the vast majority of the real figure is simply the value of the equipment sent to Ukraine, with the US buying modern replacements. It was also claimed that the US had spent more than $300 billion, while Europe spent a third of that. Europe is actually the majority donor of aid to Ukraine, with about $138.7 billion spent in Ukraine, beating the US by $20 billion. Europe's first move after the White House meeting was to send President Zelensky a steady stream of support via social media and traditional media. These, however, have a very thoughts and prayers vibe to them, unless Europe gets serious about Ukraine aid. The question is, can Europe get serious? And just how much can it do if it does? In early March 2025, European leaders gathered in London for a summit to decide their next steps. The likely focus was either finding a way to appease the US or at least securing new security guarantees in case of a ceasefire. But even before the issue of military aid comes into play, Europe is already scrambling for solutions, trying to prevent an even greater disaster from unfolding. Much has been said about Ukraine's inability to push Russia out of occupied territories and Russia's constant battlefield gains. However, when put into perspective, Russia is burning through as many as over 2,000 casualties a day to gain hundreds of meters at a time. To make matters worse, the Russian economy is in meltdown and only being propped up by mobilization for war. But a war economy is a dead-end economy, and it can only keep a nation afloat temporarily. That's because, unlike a traditional economy, a war economy focuses on producing single-use items that don't create further value. Instead of producing consumer goods for export, Russian factories churn out tanks, machines that roll onto the battlefield only to be destroyed. All the capital and labor wrapped up in creating said tank is ultimately wasted. This is why many have warned that the Russian economy is increasingly on the verge of absolute disaster. It's also why Putin is actually incentivized to continue fighting until he accomplishes one of two things: either take enough of Ukraine to plunder it economically, or fight it long enough to score some economic concessions, such as the lifting of sanctions. Either condition will cushion the inevitable economic crash that'll come the day Russian guns stop firing. Given Russia's incredibly precarious situation, it begs the question why the White House would suddenly seemingly make every effort to help them avoid the same collapse that led to the end of the Cold War. And for Europe, it creates a nightmare security scenario as Russia is rewarded for its aggression and cushioned from the worst consequences of its 3-year invasion. The cold, hard reality is that without the United States military, Europe is unlikely to be able to deter a fully mobilized Russian military from further aggression. Per one estimate, the EU would need an additional 300,000 troops and over $200 billion in spending just to keep Russia in check if the US were to fully pull out of Europe. The problem for Europe in keeping Ukraine in the fight is more of a matter of industry than money. Together, Europe can more than match the American economy, but what it's seriously lacking is a defense industry. This is a problem shared by all Western nations, including the United States, who after the end of the Cold War shuttered the vast majority of its defense manufacturers as governments turned away from defense spending. Russia's winning hand was to store away massive amounts of weapons it had produced and used during the Cold War, even if it's old. It's hard to argue with the fact that it's kept Russia in a fight where it's experienced catastrophic levels of losses. Europe, however, has never built up the same deep reserves. President Trump isn't wrong when he says that Europe has been too willing to outsource its security to the US, but that's only part of the story. For decades, American policymakers actively encouraged a weaker Europe, one that would remain dependent on US military support. After all, a strong Europe has historically had a bad habit of turning on itself, treating war like a continental pastime. Keeping Europe reliant on the US didn't just prevent internal conflict, it also gave America enormous leverage over its allies. So while Europe bears responsibility for its military weaknesses, the US does too, despite the White House's recent condemnations. It was America who lent its political support to politicians that were against rearmament for decades. At the moment, Europe relies heavily on overseas defense manufacturers, primarily the US, South Korea, Turkey, and Israel. Yet for all 4 countries, defense manufacturers are already facing massive backlogs and waiting lists that are years long for a lot of high-end items such as Patriot air defense batteries. Europe has invested into expanding its defense industry, but this has proven politically difficult and it still isn't enough. The biggest problem to date for Europe and the United States is uncertainty. Defense manufacturers are hesitant to open new plants without assurances of multi-year purchase contracts. That's because it's very expensive to build a new factory, train workers, and source raw materials, a process that can take over a year or more. This massive investment in capital and time means that a defense contractor needs assurances that it will all be worth it, with assurances of multi-year spending contracts from governments. This has been difficult to guarantee for a continent where even now defense spending remains unpopular. But the situation is made worse by the fact that even 3 years on, there is no clear goal from either Europe or America for Ukraine. For years, President Biden carefully avoided saying outright that the goal of US aid to Ukraine was Russia's defeat. Now with President Trump in office, the situation has shifted even further. Europe likewise has followed suit, with no clear end goal for the conflict from the continent. This means that a defense manufacturer must consider that contracts may come haltingly and end suddenly due to changing political winds, ultimately making expansion of production capabilities an economic loss. This means that Europe has routinely fallen short on promises to Ukraine, such as increasing artillery shell production to 1 million rounds a year as promised in March 2023. It took until only recently for Europe to achieve this goal, and yet this still isn't enough. Russia is estimated to be producing 4.5 million artillery shells a year and has been doing this for the last 2 years. It's bewildering how Russia, a nation with a fraction the economy of either the EU or the US, is so significantly outpacing Western military production. But it all comes down to a perception on the nature of war. And if Europe doesn't change its perception, it's doomed to a future where Russia wins in Ukraine and is posed to strike even deeper into Europe. For Russia, the Ukraine conflict has become an existential one. Losing in Ukraine represents a threat to Vladimir Putin's regime, and thus by proxy to the Russian Federation. Putin is well aware of how the war in Afghanistan directly contributed to the collapse of the USSR, and is wary of how such a similar disaster would spell the end for himself as well. There's already pressure from some Russian territories due to a perceived weakness of the Russian state itself. A loss would prove this weakness to be true, possibly leading to the dissolution of major parts of the Russian Federation. Russia is fighting for its life, but Europe is fighting for business. Despite the fact that a Russian victory is a threat to European security, few Europeans have seen it as such, at least until the recent actions of the US. For the majority of this war, military support for Ukraine was largely a financial decision, with profit margins of defense contractors to consider. Further complicating Europe's supply efforts to Ukraine is the collective need to replenish and rearm domestic militaries ahead of any aid sent to Ukraine. Europe has already sent massive amounts of equipment to Ukraine, leaving its own stockpiles in need of urgent replenishment. At the time, fear of further Russian aggression has pushed European nations to prioritize their own defense, ramping up military spending and modernization efforts. But with defense manufacturers already stretched thin, most production is now being directed toward rebuilding domestic forces, meaning any resupply to Ukraine is now taking a back seat. The White House's recent comments only compounded these fears and made the situation even more difficult. Nations now have had their worst fears confirmed. They will likely have to face further Russian aggression on their own. This has driven up the demand for domestic military expansion even higher, making less room for equipment resupply to Ukraine. The problem, however, is self-inflicted. Ukraine is fighting today the war that Europe fears it'll have to fight tomorrow. Yet, with Russia's military so severely weakened by the conflict, there's no immediate conventional threat to Europe as long as European nations stand united. Rather than stockpiling weapons for a potential future war, Europe could instead send those arms to Ukraine now, where they're actually needed to fight Russia directly, potentially preventing the very conflict Europe is bracing for. Yet, while it makes perfect sense when seen from a bird's-eye view like this, the political reality is far more complicated. This is where American security guarantees were so important. They allowed European nations to dig deep into their own stocks of equipment, confident that they would be protected if the worst were to come to pass. Yet the current administration's decision to withdraw U.S. protection from Europe has set the stage for geopolitical disaster, one that could lead to Ukraine's defeat and soon after a new war once Russia has had a few short years to rebuild its military. Ultimately, the truth is Russia can't stop fighting now. Its economy is entirely too dependent on continued conflict. And now Europe faces two choices: agree to a ceasefire and immediately lift all sanctions, or agree to a ceasefire without lifting of sanctions. It makes sense not to lift the sanctions as a way of punishing Russia for starting the war in the first place. It also sends a strong deterrent message to the rest of the world. However, this also means that in order to keep its economy afloat, Russia will need to build more weapons, not stop. Within just the span of a few short years, Russia's military will have swelled to pre-war levels, with manpower boosted thanks to the annexation of Ukraine. From there, it only makes sense to continue the war into the rest of Europe. The second choice, to agree to a ceasefire and lift all sanctions, would cushion the Russian economy and give Putin the option to demobilize without an economic disaster that costs him his presidency. But this sends a message to the world that aggression is rewarded in the modern era. Even worse, it would economically strengthen Russia, so it's in a better position to threaten Europe after a period of rebuilding and integrating Ukraine. Basically, Europe faces a devil's choice without America, and without some serious changes in policy, it's not set to support Ukraine through to a victory. Can Europe step up and defend Ukraine without US support, or is a Russian victory inevitable? Share your thoughts in the comments. Now go check out how Ukraine war is reshaping the US military, or click this other video instead.